All right, today I'll be talking about Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. It's interesting that I happen to be reading this book at the same time that the Wuthering Heights movie is kind of blowing up and igniting a lot of conversation about classical reading and interpretation and love affair, taking the sexual aspects from a book about class and completely ignoring the class aspects, which Lady Chatterley's Lover is very similar in that sense that there's a steamy romance going on here, and a lot of people focus on the romance way more than the much more overt class aspects of the story. But that's neither here or there. So focusing on the thing that the book is actually about, why this book? I legitimately think this one is just doing a crossword, and D.H. Lawrence's name came up, and he's kind of like one of those classic novelists that you don't hear much about. You know, he's nowhere near the heights of a lot of the other classic novelists of that time. Your sort of 1920s and 1900s, early 1900s period novelists, particularly being English. So I just wanted to go ahead and give one of his books a try. And I don't know why I picked this one particularly. I don't think I really did. I think I just kind of picked one at random. So that's why I picked it up. The story is about Lady Chatterley marrying her husband and becoming the mistress of, marrying her husband and becoming the lady of the house, not mistress, but the lady of the house. And in Nottingham. Sorry, I had to look it up really quickly. Ragby House. It sounds so weird to me. Ragby House. Anyway, Ragby House. And how she and her husband don't get along very well, and she finds comfort in the groundskeeper, and how they go on to have this sort of illicit affair. It eventually ends with her wanting to leave her husband for the housekeeper, but how sort of the perception of class dynamics plays into the struggle to do so. That's the plot, but thematically there's a lot going on here with class, like I said. Moving forward into the general to whom would I recommend this to, anybody who enjoys sort of English writing on class. Like Dickens obviously is like the big name, but this is kind of a more modern take on it. Anybody who enjoys that kind of classic English sort of writing, I would really invite to do this. If this book is known for one thing, it's known for its frank graphic descriptions of sex and certain aspects of sex. And I will say it is really surprising to see a book from the late 20s talking about cunts and penises and fucking, using literally those words. But at the same time, using more poetic language as well, like the fire licking at their loins or whatever. So it's an interesting mix of bluntness, but at the same time, more abstract and poetic language, which is very interesting. So that's to whom I would recommend this book. Although really, I think it's extremely easy to read for anybody. Very pleasant read. Not complicated at all in terms of understanding its dynamics, and I think particularly interesting in the context of sort of what's going on today across the world with the sort of increasing wealth gap and the dying out of the middle class and so forth, to see a book that's kind of looking at the rise of the middle class, at least, and from the perspective of a wealthy person and kind of the disdain that goes on with that. So to get into the pros and the cons, easy to read, even though there's a lot of dialect, none of it really catches you up, and the version that I have comes with easy cliff notes, so you can go back and flip through those. But personally, I found I just stopped caring after a while because you can intuit the overwhelming majority of it. A con is that there are some phrases in Latin or French, which is pretty common at the time for works like these, and I find slightly obnoxious insofar as I would prefer it just to have a little asterisk with the translation at the bottom, because having to flip to the back of the book, to actually stop what I'm reading and flip to the back of the book to look up the translation, really breaks the flow. The irony to me is that Infinite Jest specifically used not Cliff Notes, footers, end notes, to do this. To deliberately, David Foster Wallace wanted to break up the flow. This is just one of the most well-known things about the book, specifically to complicate the reading process, but fuck it, he didn't need to make a book about that. This is just the experience of reading some of these books. It's annoying. Like, just have it at the bottom of the page, please, so I don't have to flip to the back of the book all the time. Another pro is I think it's an interesting representation because it's written from a female perspective at a time when it feels like most books wouldn't have been written from the female perspective, and it feels a lot more fair to women and the experience of being a woman and being critical of men than I feel a lot of books at this time would have been. I'm sure somebody can come up with better examples of that. I'm not denying that, but for what it is, it feels like an interesting insight, which isn't to say that it's perfect, but insofar as the idea of a man writing what sex feels like from a woman's perspective, I tend to be more of the opinion that you're welcome to try, and in the same way that a woman is welcome to try to write the experience of sex from a man's perspective. I don't particularly like to be limiting on that, but as to its accuracy in that perspective, obviously, as a male, I can't really speak to it. I would actually greatly enjoy hearing a female's perspective on the book, because I feel like in a lot of ways it's fairer to women than a lot of books are at the time. But at the same time, I can also appreciate some of the ways in which you might take issue with the way that women are portrayed. Certainly, I know that I have complicated feelings about the way that certain men are portrayed in the book, not in the sense of them being bastards or whatnot, but sort of the thematic overture that a sort of return to nature, or return to men having balls or whatever, or manly men, the way that it's written is kind of hit and miss for me. But that's I think on the whole, it's definitely, for it the time that it's written, gives a interesting balance to the genders, and the idea of a male author at this time writing a book almost completely from the female perspective. There are times when you get inside the male's head, is really interesting, and I sort of appreciated reading that perspective. In terms of the cons, this kind of falls between a pro and a con depending on how you feel it. It's very, very blunt sort of in its symbolism and representation, and I think that makes it a good book for people who are kind of just getting into literature, or maybe who struggle with a bit more of the metaphorical nature of literature, in the sense that it's not hard to sort of understand things. Like, I always kind of go back to, in high school, we're always taught that the light in the dock at the distance, from Gatsby's, when he would look over to Daisy's dock and he'd see the light in the distance, that, oh, the light in the distance is the American dream. And I find that a wildly, I don't even agree with that interpretation, but to then even give this interpretation flatly to students, rather than letting them draw their own interpretation, because really, to me, it's more broadly about longing, and the way that there's that sort of open-endedness about how you can talk about this sort of interpretive element, and that's without even getting into surrealist works and stuff like that. I appreciate that Lady Chatterley's Lover has that kind of obvious metaphor, obvious symbolism, but it's also not going to make you struggle to understand it. So I think that, for more advanced readers, it can come across as a little bit too on the nose, although I believe that some of that is intentional. Like, I will talk about Chapter 13 in particular, I really enjoyed. But net sum, I think that it's good for people who are maybe wanting to understand or flex those muscles a bit more. Which isn't to call it like amateur or lesser, just more easily understood and identified. So, moving on to the themes a bit. The primary theme of the book is class, in the same way that the sort of so in the same way that Wuthering Heights was about the relationship between servants and masters, and you had a master who kind of fell in love with a servant, but Wuthering Heights was a lot more amoral and gothic and tragic about it. With the Lady Chatterley's Lover is a lot more comical, almost farcical about it, insofar as I'm specifically reminded of Chapter 13, which I mentioned earlier, where you have her husband, who was injured in World War I and is unable to walk. And they're going out, but he has a lot of money, and they're going out in the woods, walking in the woods, and he's in his electric wheelchair. And one of the earliest indicators is while they're going around, he's talking about how beautiful nature is, while his electric wheelchair is just crushing all these flowers. And she's looking, Constance is her name, and his name is Clifford. And Clifford is crushing all the flowers with his electronic wheelchair, and Connie's looking at them and kind of lamenting his sort of destruction of nature. And again, the symbolism is very obvious. The industry running ramshot through the nature and crushing it, which is especially interesting because earlier on in the story, he mentions the wood, mentions wanting to preserve the wood, while at the same time, paradoxically, he's out here crushing the woods, crushing the nature beneath his wheelchair. But this is also indicative of Clifford's larger transformation from a sort of intelligent individual into a shell of a person. But we'll move on to that later. But then while he's doing this, he's talking about his revitalized interest in coal mining, because this area is a coal mining town, and he's taken a huge interest in it recently and gotten involved, and he's starting to feel like a big man, like a leader. But at the same time that he's taking an interest in this, the sort of big problem is that they're having trouble selling their coal. Workers are struggling to feed their families, they're not getting enough work, and they're becoming poorer and poorer. So while he's using his science and his industry to try and make more money and profit the most off of it, at the same time, the people that he's ostensibly meant to rule over are getting poorer and poorer. And when Connie points this out to him, he sort of defends himself by saying that people are always going to be sort of lazy or half-hearted. They always need someone to rule over them, these sort of commoners. That it's not that he is necessarily a bad person, although he absolutely believes that he is fit to rule and right to rule, but that also he somebody has to do it, and they need to be led. The commoners need to be led. And she sort of disagrees with this, but he, starts talking about his heritage, the upper class, blah, blah, blah. And mind at this point, he's described as having become rather obese. So later on, when his chair gets stuck, Connie tries to help him because I believe he's going up a hill, and Connie tries to help him by giving him push. And he actually refuses her assistant, saying, "Let the motor do it." And he tries to push the motor, and he tries to push the motor, and he tries to push the motor, and it won't work. And finally, the gameskeeper comes. He summons the gameskeeper to try and put the chair on some tiles, and then push it again, and push it again, and push it again. Not literally physically push, but to push the motor. And finally, the motor breaks. It's no longer working. And he has the groundskeeper get on his stomach and look underneath, check the gears, even though the groundskeeper says he knows nothing about gears. He knows nothing about this kind of machinery. He's a groundskeeper and a blacksmith. He's not a mechanic. But he forces him to get on his stomach, to wriggle around to underneath the chair to find the problem. But obviously he can't. He can only identify that there is a problem. And then ultimately what it comes down to is the gamekeeper nearly kills himself because they have to physically lift up not just the chair, but Clifford himself in the chair and get it out of this rut that Clifford has made. So, and then both the gamekeeper and his wife, or rather both the gamekeeper and Connie, have to push Clifford all the way back home in his now useless defunct chair. And the sort of metaphor for this is what I mean when I say like it's really easy to figure out what's going on. The metaphor for industry and how it's ultimately carried on the backs of the common people, and how really just empty this upper class right to rule claim is, in light of the fact that it functions on the back of the average people, the lower class, and like with Connie's case, some of the women. It is ultimately just so on the nose, but funny. I found it genuinely pretty hysterical to read, and I kind of laughed out loud at the situation, even though for Connie it was very humiliating. But to just kind of render the ineptitude of the upper class so flatly was very intriguing, very enjoyable. And it's the class dynamics, but also the period in time and the shifting attitudes and the rise of industry over nature, and how that in turn makes for weak people is another huge theme going on throughout the book. Clifford has this sort of gradual devolution from being at first a writer who writes works which are described as, popular but not very substantive. I don't think Clifford is ever really much of a sort of deep or well-rounded individual. Not to say like in terms of the way his character is written, but as a person, I don't think he's well-rounded. But there is an intellectual curiosity to him which attracts Connie in the earlier days. But for example, when he installs a radio in the Wargby Hall, he spends more and more of his time listening to radio instead of reading, and he's described as doing so with kind of a blank expression on his face. When he spends time with the housekeeper, with his personal nurse, gambling the night away rather than doing much for self-betterment. There's that. It's interesting also the sort of dynamic between the upper class sort of empty philosophizing that they like to do versus the sort of industrial scientific side of things, insofar as tying back into this evolution. At the start of the book, Clifford has these friends that he would invite to Ragby Hall, and he and his friends would talk about things, the current sort of crisis, the political and philosophical ideas, the place of certain people, and so on and so forth. And at first, Connie kind of enjoys these talks, but as they go on and on and on, she starts to find them tedious. But also, as Clifford undergoes this sort of transformation away from philosophizing into the more natural sciences, these talks cease. His writing career ends, and he starts to get more and more interested in the coal mines, which to this point he was more than happy to leave alone. He actually becomes shallower and more vapid as a person than even when he was doing his hollow philosophizing. And it's interesting that the book, it describes him getting worse, but at the same time, it's not exactly saying that what he was before was good or great. It's just this kind of gradual downhill trend until finally, at the very end, the way it concludes by describing him as a man who can be extremely cold and calculating, externally, when he's among the men, he can be strict and sharp and be a good leader. But when it comes to his insides, he's extremely soft, extremely insecure, extremely empty. And the way this just kind of ends up reflecting a lot of the businessmen and leaders that we have today is really the more things change, the more they stay the same. One of the things I always find interesting about reading older books is seeing how much they hold up. And overall, that's something about Lady Chatterley's Lover that is so interesting about it as a book in terms of this conversation of class, is how it feels just as relevant today, albeit, there's just this increasing, it talks about the kind of death of an upper class and the rise of a middle class, of an industrial class, but at the same time, and it does so with a sort of lamentation of the loss of beauty and the rise of the sort of more baser forms of entertainment and baser forms of living, which, while I sympathize with, at the same time, what we're living with in the present is kind of a reversal of that, in terms of you're seeing a rise of the upper class and the death of the middle class. And a lot of it is, ironically, a consequence of people becoming addicted to these sort of baser forms of entertainment. The way Clifford is described as listening to the radio with a blank expression on his face is really no different from the way that people doom scroll on their phones, or the way that he gets together with his friends and they have these sort of empty philosophical conversations. Even though in the book they're meant to be the upper class, I really don't see them as all that different as a lot of the empty, vapid circle jerking that goes on in the echo chambers on websites like Reddit or 4chan. It's really just been kind of a shift in how we communicate with each other. Sure, you don't have a sort of class divide in the sense that if a woman from the upper class marries somebody from the lower class, there's going to be this big, huge scandal. But at the same time, many of the problems of industry, many of the problems of social expectation are not only as bad as they ever were, but are in many ways getting worse. So to that end, it's just a very interesting book. And even if I don't necessarily agree with the idea that the solution is a sort of return to a more natural lifestyle. In fact, obviously I would encourage more education, more reading, and things like that, which seems to just produce, which in some ways Lawrence seems to be against, insofar as it sort of produces sort of empty banter for the sake of banter. At the same time, I think that there's at least a common recognition that certainly there is a need for a more honest connection between people. And like I mentioned earlier, the stuff about being a real man, and how, he mentions that if Clifford were a real man, he'd accept what had happened and let his wife divorce him and sort of move on with it. But instead he's being a sort of petty little quote-unquote new man. And there's a constant mentioning of women and their wills, and this is where I mention or start to really question what I say about it being sort of forward in some of its representation of women, where it seems like it's critical of willful women, but I don't know if that's quite something that I agree with, if I'm reading it correctly. But I do agree that there are certainly certain individuals, whether it's male or female, who kind of go so far in their self-righteousness that they end up denying themselves any kind of happiness and any kind of real connection with people, because they are on such an absurdist crusade of increasing social justice or social values to a point that they become completely blinded to the humanist aspect. But that's all extremism. Extremism looks the same whether you're left or right, kind of the horseshoe effect. And I don't know if I agree with this idea that a sort of return to more simplicity is the right answer, but I certainly agree with this sort of third theme, which is the desire for a more honest connection between people. The sort of impression that I get reading it is that Connie really likes to be railed quite hard in the bed, and that's fine for her, but to describe all women as wanting this kind of force of nature and surrendering yourself to it is kind of, just because it works for you doesn't necessarily mean it's the universal solution. But I'm willing to just take it up to the point where it works for Connie and not expand it much beyond that, though it's kind of difficult to do so. I think that aspect of the book I do kind of disagree with. But on the whole, interesting book, very enjoyable, very easy to read, but not, necessarily the most complex or dynamic thing in the world. More of a social statement that I think is really fascinating for the time in which it was written and the times that we live in today, necessarily than anything that it does that's super crazy on its own right. But that's not bad. I obviously like to think of art as standalone, but art always exists in context, and I think you can never really divorce the context from the book. It's always a sort of sliding scale on how much the context is necessary to appreciating the work of art. So that's Lady Chatterley's Lover. Join me next time when I will talk about Rudin by Ivan Turgenev. So see you then.